Okay, well tonight we're going to go over chess tactics. In particular, the subject is double attacks. Last week we went through another tactical concept of pinning. So this is an extension. All these examples are taken from Siegbert Teresh's book, The Game of Chess. He copyrighted it in America in 1935. The young boys who sometimes come and watch these sessions aren't here tonight because it's Halloween. So they're out playing. All right, well, we'll jump right in. So double attacks, what you look for unprotected pieces. And you try to attack two pieces with the queen or a bishop, rook, or knight. Sometimes they're called forks. Since you're attacking two pieces, you usually win one unless one of the pieces can move and protect the other one. Or the other defense is if there's a strong counterattack. So you don't protect the pieces, you get your own threat of maybe threatening a checkmate or another major threat. That would be a defense. So we'll start out with some pretty simple examples. This one's pretty simple. Okay, it's white to move and win. It's only one move. Do either of you two guys see the winning move? Well, let's look at it this way. Remember, we're looking for unprotected pieces. What are black's unprotected pieces in this position?
It's the bishop on e7.
Yeah. And the other unprotected piece?
Pawn.
Which pawn?
F7.
Oh, F7. Yeah, that's unprotected. And
The rook.
the rook. I think we're focusing on pieces this time rather than pawns, in this example anyway. Okay, so there's a rook on A8, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a bishop on E7. One's on a black square, one's on a white square. Now that we know what we're going to attack, all you have to do is find a piece that can attack both the bishop and rook at the same time.
E4.
Which move?
Queen to e4.
Right. And as you can see, the rook can't move, so it obviously can't protect the bishop.
Mm-hmm.
The bishop's on a black square, so obviously it can't protect the rook on a white square, and so that wins. So that's example one. This is again a win for white. So the first thing to do if you're white is to look for the unprotected pieces. What are they this time?
The knight on e4 and bishop on e7.
Right. And it's convenient in this example that we already have a rook lined up on both those pieces. The only problem as far as getting a double attack goes are knights in the way between the bishop and our rook, right?
Yep.
All right, so that's going to suggest a knight move somewhere. That would allow us to attack the two pieces, and if the black knight moves, naturally we'll take the bishop. Now, there's two possible moves for the knight. See if you guys can pick out the right move. What's the right move for white? So you want to retreat the knight to a safe spot. There's really two possibilities. Which of the two is the correct move for white?
Say knight to f3.
Okay, and what was the other possibility?
d3.
That's right. Now, what's the difference between f3 and d3 for white as far as future moves go? Do you see a drawback to the move you suggested, knight to f3?
Yeah, the knight f3, then rook takes, and then rook d1 check.
Yeah, that would lead to checkmate. So we couldn't take that knight right away. In fact, we wouldn't even be threatening it. But knight to d3 blocks the rook, and the knight's protected by a pawn. So that's stronger because it threatens rook takes knight right away, right? Now there's one other point that you need to keep in mind. After we play knight to d3, he obviously can't move his knight anywhere. We take the bishop, right?
Right.
So the only alternative is for him to protect the knight, right?
Yes, play F5.
Right.
And then we will play F3.
Right. Exactly. Now, another drawback to knight to f3 would have been that we block the f2 pawn, and we wouldn't have the resource f3 to drive the knight away, which you just pointed out, which is how we're going to win this game.
Right.
Okay, so we've established knight to d3. Black has no choice but to play f5, and then the right move is to drive the knight away with the pawn. If the knight moves, we take the bishop. So far, so good, right? Does black have any alternative moves besides moving the knight?
Candidate moves?
Yeah, candidate moves. Any moves at all besides moving the knight that would at least prevent the immediate loss of a piece. When we moved that pawn on f2 to f3, we opened up a line toward our king, didn't we?
Yeah, so I'm assuming bishop c5.
Check.
Check.
That's right. And if we do knight takes bishop, then knight takes knight, and it looks like black has gotten out of his problem. But let's go into it because there's a trick here for white. So the best move for black is bishop to c5, just like you said.
And then king h1.
No. King h1 doesn't work because he does knight to f2 check. We have to do knight takes. He does bishop takes, attacking our rook.
Okay.
We move the rook, he moves the bishop back, and he saved his piece. So the right move is knight takes bishop. Okay, knight takes bishop. Wait a minute, there we go. Black obviously has to take back. Now the attack continues. There's not two unprotected pieces, there's one unprotected piece now, right?
Yeah.
That's the knight on c5. What square is it on? It's a black square.
Yeah.
Do we have a piece that can attack black squares?
Yep.
What's that?
It's the bishop.
Okay. Now, notice further that the knight at c5 and the rook in f8 are on the same diagonal. That's the black diagonal. How can we take advantage of those facts to make a strong attacking move for white, and what do you think it is? What are the different bishop moves that white can make? Check out all the possible bishop moves. Which are there's two moves that actually threaten a black piece. What are those two moves?
That would be bishop e3.
Right.
Bishop g5.
Okay, now let's look at the first one. Let's take a quick look at bishop to e3. That is a strong threat. Bishop takes knight, but black could move his knight back somewhere, couldn't he?
Yeah.
The other thing is, a black, he would get double pawns, but he could play b6 and protect the knight too, right?
Right, yeah.
All right. In any case, we may have a better position than black, but we don't have an outright win. Now let's look at the other move you suggested. Bishop to g5, we attack the rook. That gains us a temple or another move because he obviously has to move the rook, right?
Right.
Where can he move the rook? Okay, let's take a look at rook to d7. You wouldn't move it behind a pawn because then you wouldn't have any good moves in the future, okay?
Yeah.
But at least on d7, he defends his second row, black's second row, and he can move to all the squares on the file, depending on what happens. Now remember, I told you that the black knight on c5 and the rook on f8 are lined up on the same diagonal. Can we attack both those pieces with another bishop move? Notice that the square e7 is protected by our rook on e1, isn't it?
Yeah.
So we can move our bishop to e7 and fork or attack the two pieces, the rook on f8 and the knight, and once we move the bishop off our first row, the two rooks protect each other, so there's no pin by black. So black moves the rook, we take the knight. If he moves the knight, we take the rook, and we win a rook for a bishop, 5 points for 3 points. But there's one other move for black besides rook to d7. This is where it gets really tricky. Can that rook on d8 protect the knight and move away from the bishop at the same time? Remember, our bishop's on g5. We're doing this in our head. Where can that black rook move to protect the knight on c5?
You gotta go to d5.
Yeah, rook to d5. Now, if the bishop forks the other rook and the knight, the rook moves, and it looks like we can't do bishop takes knight because he can answer rook takes bishop, right?
Right.
There's one last trick to it. So let's go to that position. Bishop to g5, rook to d5, bishop to e7, rook to e8. Okay. Now, white's problem, he's within a couple moves of finishing and winning a piece. He's attacking the knight on c5. It's defended by the rook. Can he drive the rook away from d5 with any move?
Yeah, that would be pawn to c4.
Yeah, that's the winning move. Congratulations. c4. He can't go to e5 because our rook on e1 covers that square. He can go back and attack the bishop, but the bishop's going to move and take the knight off the board, right?
Right.
Yep, so that's it. That was more complicated. That was kind of a fun example. This is not a win of a piece in this position. It does show some possible double attacks if the position isn't played quite right for white and black. So we'll walk through them. White starts off, he moves his knight to e4. Now, what does the knight attack from e4? There's two black, a piece and a pawn that he can capture. So what's white's threat? Mario, what's white's threat?
I believe it's to basically win a pawn.
Knight takes c5 or bishop takes c5?
Yeah.
Okay, now that's true, but black has some counterattacks. Now let's talk about what black has. Notice that black bishop on d6 attacks the white pawn on h2. And notice that the black queen can move from d8 to h4, where it would also threaten the pawn at h2. Now the white squared black bishop on c8, it could, at some point in the position, it could move itself to b7 and see how it would be on that long diagonal, attacking the knight, but beyond the knight it would attack the king-knight-2 square. So if the bishop was at b7 and attacked the king-knight, the g2 square, the pawn in front of the king, notice that it's possible if the white bishop wasn't at e3, the black queen could go to g5, maybe in the future, and the queen and the bishop could attack the point g2, the pawn at g2.
Yeah.
Okay, so those are the main possibilities. Now the other possibility for white, he may decide that taking that pawn is too risky. The safe thing for white to do would be to take the bishop. You see, white sees an attack by two bishops and a queen coming his way. That attack is going to be pretty strong. So the safe thing for white is to get rid of the two bishops by taking the bishop on the black square d6. Now it's true that that helps black in the sense that black can undouble his weak double pawns by c7 takes d6. But what white gains from doing that is his kingside position is safe. So sometimes in chess you can't get everything you want. You have to go for safety. So this example, let's walk through what happens. Okay, the first one is, look, black has a possibility right off the bat of taking that pawn on h2 with check. The king takes it. Now the queen comes up to h4 check, attacks the king and the knight. There's our double attack. The king has to go back to g1. The queen takes e4. And black looks like black won a pawn. But that's not as good as it looks at first blush, because he has a pawn on c5 that's unprotected, and that black squared bishop can just snap it off. Then white's going to have three pawns on the queen side connected, you see that? And black is going to have two. And remember, a queen side pawn majority in the ending can lead to a win, because you can get a passed pawn, and it takes black longer and the white king is on the king side. He can stop any passed pawn that's created over there. So now white does take that pawn, and notice the bishop threatens the rook and the queen. Another double attack, isn't it? This time the double attack isn't by the bishop attacking two things, bishop attacking the rook on f8 and the queen attacking the queen. So there's no choice, but black has to do queen takes queen, queen takes e2, and then the rook takes e2. Now the black rook has to move. The only square open is d8. Now, let's look at this position objectively. We're in an ending. Black has a bishop on c8 that's still in its initial position. It is undeveloped, isn't it?
Right, yeah.
Black has a bishop on c5, different color than the black bishop, which is a white square bishop. But black's bishop on c5 is stronger and developed. Also notice that because the bishop's still on c8, the two rooks aren't protecting each other. It's going to take black at least a move. He's got to move that bishop out of the way before he can oppose rooks on the e-file. The other thing is white's rook on queen rook 1 can move over to e8, for example, and he can double rooks on the e-file. And then black can't move a rook over there to oppose rooks, right? And then he can't move his king to f8 to defend a rook on e8 because the bishop guards the f8 square. So what this amounts to is a better ending with winning chances for white. It's not a clear win, but white has better chances. We'll do one more move. The best move for white is to grab the 7th rank and attack that pawn on c7. That pawn can't be defended by a rook. He can't do rook to d7 because that would give us rook to e8 checkmate. Now he might try rook to b8 and counterattack our pawn that's undefended on b2. We won't go any further than this. Black might be able to hold it, but okay. Now let's look at a different move. So the first try by black, bishop takes h2 check, it was pretty, but it didn't really work. Now let's look at another move for black, bishop to b7. This might be a better move. Notice he continued developing another piece. The bishop moves to b7. Whenever you can develop a piece with a threat, it's worth considering the move. So the bishop threatens the knight, and now the rooks and queen, the bishop got out of the way, they all protect each other, don't they? So white can't do anything in the e file because it's all protected. So this is a stronger. Now, let's say, okay. Now, let's take a look at knight takes pawn. It looks like a good move because it threatens that bishop on b7, doesn't it? But remember, I told you the bishop on b7 attacks that pawn on g2. Remember that? And that the queen could come up and attack the pawn. So knight takes pawn actually loses. Bishop takes knight. That safeguards our bishop on b7. And it takes the bishop from e3 to a square that she's not protected. And it opens up the g5 square. When the bishop was on e3, the queen couldn't go to g5, could it? So now the winning move is queen to g5, threatening queen to g2 checkmate, and the bishop at the same time. There's our double attack. Again, the theme of these examples. There's no defense to that. Okay. Now there's another try. There's another way to win the pawn. We just saw that knight takes pawn doesn't work. How about if white does bishop takes pawn first? What happens then? Now, it's a big difference. Now, if the bishop on b7 takes the knight, we don't do queen takes bishop. The answer is bishop takes d6, and we attack the rook on f8, gaining a tempo. Black has to take our bishop on d6. Let's say he does queen takes. Well, then we do queen takes pawn. Queen takes bishop on e4, and we're a pawn up, right? So we're safe. That would work out good for us. So the move for black, the possible move for black, bishop on b7 takes e4, doesn't work for black, does it? Now we have to look at the other possibility. Bishop takes bishop. So let's look at that, and I'll bring it up on the board. Okay, so the only possible move is knight takes c5. Now, threatening mate doesn't work because he can just take our bishop and win a piece, right? But the same idea works with a twist. Do you guys see the winning move?
Bishop takes g2.
Right, bishop takes g2. King takes. And now the queen can come up with check to the same square, double attack, and get that knight back, and it's probably going to be a draw. King moves back somewhere, and queen takes knight. That's probably a draw. So the conclusion, we're back to the original statement I made. when the bishop attacks the knight, what's the safe move for white?
That would be knight g3.
Well, better than retreating, it would be better to liquidate the bishop on d6.
Okay.
So knight takes d6. Now, black doesn't have enough pieces to attack the king's side. So the best move for black is to undouble the pawns. See, with our bishop on e3, black can't move queen to g5. Can't threaten mate. He can't move from the black square d8 to c6, where the bishop and queen are on the same diagonal to g2. That's called a battery, by the way. So he can't go there, at least not for a couple moves. And even if he got his queen to c6, we could just move our queen up to g4. You see that? And the queen would protect backwards to the g2 pawn. And if the white queen got to g4, we would have the threat bishop to h6, threatening queen takes, knight pawn, checkmate ourselves. Anyway, this should be a draw. They have the same number of pawns. They have bishops of opposite colors, same number of queens and rooks, so it should be a draw. The computer says that white has a slight advantage, though. Okay, let's go on to the next example. This one is real simple. It starts out with black making a blunder. I won't have you guess what the blunder is, but black has the better position. He has his rook on his 7th rank, white's 2nd rank. So that's a rook on the 7th. See how it attacks all the squares along the 2nd row. And he has a strong knight on f4, attacking the white squares h3, g2, e2, and d3. Now they're defended by the bishop, so there's no checkmate or anything for black. But the other good thing about the knight on f4, notice it's blocking the pawn on f3. That's an ideal situation for a knight, is to be blocking the opponent's pawn, and there are no pawns at g2 or e2 to drive the knight away, and there's no black squared bishop to trade the knight away, and there's no knight to trade the knight away, so that knight is never going to be driven off of f4. And the knight's protected by the rook on f8. So the only way to drive that knight away would be if both rooks lined up on the 4th row for white, but that would have other drawbacks because he would leave his back row undefended and other things. So black has the better position, even has an extra pawn. He's got 4 pawns to 3. In this example, black gets greedy. He sees there's a pawn at h2. That's a double question mark move. What's the winning move for white? Right, double attack, check, attacking king and rook or forking the king and rook. So that one's real simple. Okay, now this is a case where all you have to do is find one winning move for black. It's one move away. Take a few minutes and see if you can find the winning move for black. Now remember, what I told you was all these examples are double attacks. We want to find 2 pieces that aren't defended. Does anybody see 2 white pieces that aren't defended?
The rook on a1.
That's definitely one that's undefended. Is there another piece? This is a bit of a trick question. Let me give you a hint. Notice that the black rooks, one of them is real strong on g8. It's attacking that pawn on g2, right? Very strong rook. The other rook is behind the knight next to the king. It's on d8. It can't move anywhere except over to the, he could go to the e file, but then he doesn't threaten anything immediately. Anyway, black has one really good rook and one rook that's not bad, but it's just defensive. The rook on d8 is just defensive right now. Does anyone see what that rook on g8 is doing? Vis-a-vis the pawn on g2?
Yeah, it's X-raying the king on g1.
That's right. That pawn is what? What's the chess term?
Pin.
Pinned. Does a pinned pawn effectively protect some other piece?
I don't think so.
It doesn't. What piece is that pawn? It looks like it's protecting, but it's not really. The knight on f3. Now we have our two unprotected pieces. One of them, technically the pawn protects it, but because of the rook pin, it's not an effective protection. So that's our two pieces. Now do you see how to attack the rook and the knight at the same time with what move?
Yeah, queen c3.
Right, queen to c3.
Queen c3.
Now, there's no way to protect the rook. The rook's worth more than the knight, so the rook moves somewhere, and then the winning move is queen takes knight, and black won a piece, right? Okay, so sometimes you have to look a little deeper into it. These are not always that easy to figure out. Okay, let's look at this position before I tell you who's winning. Let's start with the white pieces. White has a serious problem. Number one, his knight on e4 is attacked, isn't it?
Yeah.
Number two, black's queen has penetrated into the middle of white's position on g2, and the queen on g2 threatens that rook on h1 with queen takes rook check, right?
Right.
Okay. So right off the bat, the rook on h1 and the knight on e4 pose a real problem for white. Now, that white squared bishop on b5, it attacks a knight, but the knight's defended by a pawn, isn't it?
Yeah.
So that bishop really isn't doing much for white, is it?
No.
He doesn't have time to do bishop takes knight because queen takes rook check, the king moves. He could take the rook on a1 or take the knight with the queen. What a lovely choice to have. Notice that that bishop is what? Remember, our theme is unprotected pieces. So that bishop is unprotected, right?
Right.
Now, we already said that the knight and the rook on h1 are unprotected. Is there another unprotected piece? And not the queen. The queen's unprotected, but because she can move in all directions, she's pretty good at fighting off an attacker. There is another unprotected piece. What is it?
The other one is rook a1.
Right. Now, is there a way that black could move and attack that unprotected bishop on b5 and the rook on a1 at the same time?
I believe it's queen takes on b2.
Right. Then the threat would be queen takes rook check and queen takes bishop, and white can't meet both of them. Okay. But white has more immediate problems than black taking his queen knight pawn. He has to protect his rook and protect his knight at the same time.
Yeah.
There's only one move that'll do that. What's that?
That's rook g1.
Well, rook to g1 doesn't quite work because there's queen takes knight.
Yeah.
When you have two pieces attacked, you have to see if one of the pieces can move and protect the other. Do you see that possibility?
Knight to f2
Okay, let's look at that. That's one possibility. Is there a way that black can eliminate that knight, taking away the protection of the rook?
No, actually.
No, you say?
Yeah. Rook takes.
Rook takes f2, immediately wins. Queen takes, rook check, king moves, or queen back. Anyway, we would have won a whole knight because we took a knight.
Right.
She took our rook, but then we took that rook, so we're knight up. Easy win. So knight to f2 doesn't work. Is there another knight move?
It was knight to g3.
Okay, knight to g3. Now we solved our immediate problem. We saved our knight on e4 and protected our rook. But remember, I told you about the other two unprotected pieces. So what's the winning move for black now?
It's still queen takes b2.
Right, because that threat is still there, isn't it?
Yeah.
And we have two unprotected pieces. We're threatening queen takes rook check and queen takes bishop, and there's no defense, is there?
I don't see one.
Rook what?
I don't see one.
Yeah, there isn't one. Okay, so much for that one. Okay, the author has white make a mistake, so there's nothing for you guys to decide yet. Black's going to win this game, but I have to make the mistake first. And that mistake is this pawn on e5 moving to e6. It looks like it might be good. It blocks that white squared bishop on c8. But it's not a good move. Does anyone see the winning move that attacks two pieces at one time for black? Let's talk about the black position for a minute. Oh, you guys have an idea? What's your idea?
How about g4?
That's a great move. It attacks the knight on f3 with the pawn, doesn't it?
And the queen attacks the bishop on d5.
But the bishop's protected by the knight on c3.
But you still have the knight attacking the bishop too.
Good point. So the threat is not queen takes bishop, but knight takes bishop first, which I think you saw. So knight takes bishop, knight takes knight, queen takes knight, and we win our piece. So white can't save this position, because if he moves the knight, then we win the piece, just like you said. So that's all there was to it. But you had to see that the pawn move, in most of our examples, we moved a queen or a bishop and we forked the king in another piece. Well, this is a little more subtle. In this case, we moved a pawn that opened up the line of the queen on the bishop. And we get our double attack from the pawn attacking the knight and the queen and knight attacking the bishop. So it's a little different than what we've seen so far. But it works just as well. Okay, this one, again, the author has, in this case, black makes a blunder, a bad move, setting up a double attack. Black takes the pawn on f6. You guys figure out the winning move for white. It's a couple moves. You got to see a couple moves here. Remember, our theme is double attacks. What's the unprotected black piece? That's the key to this.
The bishop on g5.
C5.
C5.
You got to figure out a way to attack that bishop and another piece at the same time. Anyone want to guess what the solution is? Okay, we'll go on. Notice that the knight can take the bishop. The knight and rook are on the bishop, so the queen can't take. The pawn takes, right? And the pawn moving opens up a line that white can check the black king on with what? H5, which conveniently hits C5 at the same time. That's our double attack. So, there it is. Now, just for the record books, let's go back. This is a standard opening Does anyone know what this opening is called?
I've never seen it before.
Have you ever heard of the Max Lang attack?
Yeah.
It comes out of
Yeah, it comes out of
at Gilco Piano's two nights game. Comes out of a two nights defense.
Because when he plays knight f6, then white strikes with d4.
Yeah, I'm not totally sure, but the right move for black is not to take the pawn, but to move the queen to d5, where it protects the bishop. Now, white gets that pawn on g7, and the rook comes over to try to capture it back, and it just goes on for a long number of moves from here. White has a strong attack, but black has defensive resources. If you have memorized the opening, you should be able to survive as black. Called the Max Lang attack. Okay, well, we got 5 more minutes, so let's try to get through at least 1 or 2 more. I'm going to get rid of the notation so you can't read it. There's a winning move for white. There is a double attack, not necessarily of pieces. What's the winning move for white? Mario, you got a guess?
Oh yeah, I have it.
Okay.
No, it's not gonna work because then b5. Because I was thinking queen a4, but then b5 comes in.
Yeah, that would force the queen back and protect the rook pawn at the same time. But you're on to a good idea. Is there another way to attack that pawn on a6 is an unprotected pawn? Is there another way to attack it?
On e2?
Yeah, that might be worth. What else are you threatening after queen to e2?
Pawn.
Which pawn?
On a6.
What else?
That one on
You're threatening e6 at the same time. You got 3 pieces and black only has 2. That's our double attack. In this case, it's a double attack on pawns. So that's the answer. Queen to e2, and there's no way black can defend both pawns. Okay, black wins. Now,
isn't it?
who has better attacking chances, white or black? I told you black wins, so naturally black has better, but why does black have better attacking chances?
I was actually sort of thinking maybe what happens after bishop e2. I mean, yeah, bishop e2 because now.
Go ahead.
Oh no.
What's your
not
threat?
Bishop e2, not what?
What's the threat after bishop to e2? What's black's threat?
Rook takes g2.
Yeah, then the
And king to h1, and then what's the move?
Rook d1 checkmate.
Right. You're threatening checkmate. So you can throw that bishop that's in the way of the rooks away, but you went to the right square. You attacked white's unprotected piece. What was that?
The bishop
b5. So this is a very strong move. It threatens checkmate along with the rooks on the g file, and it threatens bishop takes bishop on b5 unprotected. There's your double attack, and because of the checkmate threat, there's no answer to it.
The obvious answer would be, let's say.
There is no answer. That's the obvious answer.
I mean, you have to answer the checkmate with something, maybe like, you're gonna have to do g3 and then you're losing.
Well, look how weak your kingside position is. But after we do bishop takes bishop, eventually we can do pawn takes pawn, we could probably sacrifice the rook takes pawn, knight, queen takes check, and follow up with queen to g2 checkmate maybe. Something like that.
I couldn't see that.
Okay. Anyway, that should do it for tonight. Thanks for coming.